Okay, so we're going to look at some of the further issues in the United States. These connect well with the chapters you're reading into Cocky. So I'm not going to go so deep into this since you're reading about it, but I want to kind of highlight a few things here. First thing is, if you kind of look at the movement of the United States in the late 19th century, even during the Civil War, frankly, you see the further settling west. This leads to the so-called Indian Wars across the Midwest into the far west, northwest, and the big question becomes: all right, earlier in U.S. history was about pushing the Native Americans west, right? I mean, famously or infamously, Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears moment. What happens when you're continually being pushed west and you're wanting to settle? You think about the famous Manifest Destiny image with the Native Americans on the tail end of the left hand of the picture, almost like falling off of the picture. It kind of explains in a vivid way the situation for Native Americans as the United States expands in this territory that has been purchased and taken in the last few few years in the 19th century. In some ways, the Civil War kind of interrupts, but not really. And then once the Civil War is over, the Federal Army is utilized to assist in the kind of the bringing together of Native Americans. A helpful way to kind of just summarize what's going on. And again, like I said, the book does a good job of highlighting some of this stuff. But the one, railroad expansion; two, the killing of the buffalo; and three, the increase in settlers is what brings about these wars. Many Native American groups will basically hand themselves over to the United States, whereas others are will push back and fight. Sitting Bull, um, Crazy Horse, Geronimo. Those are some of the more famous figures to push back. With the Battle of Little Bighorn being probably the most famous example. Yes, it's also known as Custer's Last Stand. It's significant, one, because it's the greatest victory of Native Americans against the U.S. Army, but two, it's a symbolic and kind of disastrous win. Um, and I say that because, yes, the this is a win by the Lakota, um, and by the Sioux people, um, but it happens in the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the United States of America, right? Declaration of Independence, 1776. So the Battle of Little Bighorn happened at the worst time. So there is this kind of universal push now to like end these Indian wars. Um, so what's going to happen? All right, you get this surrender. What are you going to do with all these different Native American groups? Well, the push is to have Native Americans put on reservations. Um, and in fact, it's super messy. And again, the book goes into it. But the first policy is a type of like assimilation. Get Native Americans westernized, Americanized, and then instead of them basically being independent nations together with their traditions and their culture, the idea is to like break up these groups, have them live on individual lands, and it's just disaster. I think it really is a disaster. I mean, the famous one is these boarding schools where you see the forced assimilation happen. Many of these children taken away from their parents. Many commit suicide, traumatized, etc. Um, but even that, the kind of the carrot on the stick. Okay, well, we'll put you on these lands. You're gonna till the land. be left alone. That only works so far. The massacre at Wounded Knee basically happens because there is, I want to say, gold found in this area, which then brings in settlers, which then brings in the animosity between the Americans and the settlers. The army's trying to get in the middle. Then the ghost dance is picked up. This freaks out the settlers. Um, and then there's an attempt by a group to leave this reservation because of hostility. In fact, Sitting Bull is murdered during this time period there. Um, the military meets up with this band, many of women and children, and then fires upon them. It's one of the greatest massacres on U.S. soil. It happens in 1890 around the late holidays or winter holidays. So it's just kind of an ugly way, um, to end this history at this point at the end of the 19th century, because there's this kind of the disappearing native myth that was out there, that it's kind of been this long story in U.S. history. And I mean the again, they're not hiding this. It's like in plain daylight. The plan of the boarding schools, for example, were quote, kill the Indian, save the man. In other words, that language of savage is attached to Native Americans, and the idea is let's remove the quote unquote savagery from this Native American and try to quote unquote make a human being, a quote unquote civilized human being here. And all that language really fits the social Darwinism of the time, right? Like I was talking about the last lecture, about like, what the society thought were respectable, civilized people versus the other, the non-Western other. And, the big push at the end of the 19th century is colonialism, is imperialism. It's literally, French people going into Northern Africa and taking it over like it belongs to them and then bringing quote unquote civilization with them. And this is practiced all over the world. Again, Africa and Southeast Asia in particular. But even in Latin America, there's a kind of sense of wanting to become part of the big world program, and so they're basically asking to join in and do similar policies. So it really is. You think about it globally, this seems to be very much a picture of the same across the world. It's obviously, you know, warped. And like I said, I feel like we're still struggling with a lot of problems um, socially connected to some of this. So that's to the native population. The immigrant population, I think, that gets the most harassment during this time period is Chinese migrants. And this was a history, unfortunately, I think has sometimes been ignored. um, I think as of late, it's getting a lot more attention. Um, and why I bring it up, I mean, there's again a ton of political cartoons where you can kind of see this xenophobia breaking out. But my opinion on why it was somewhat ignored is a lot of this is more West Coast, California, Washington issues. In fact, it starts more on the West Coast. And again, my one of my opinions is that West Coast history is a kind of an ignored history in the big scheme of national U.S. history, where the focus is always on Washington and Boston and New York, right? So it's for East Coast bias, And I'm somebody from the West Coast, so I just tend to think that's what happens. So why I say that is most of the concrete legislation made, like literally a Chinese Exclusion Act, you have earlier legislation building up within the California world. So you already have, frankly, lynchings, massacres on a relatively local scale in California happening throughout the late 19th century. Um, and then that just gets amplified with the eventual Chinese Exclusion Act. And so, why this is important is this is the first time a particular immigrant class is like clearly stated as not being desired to come anymore. And it's weird because so Chinese immigration is limited. It's a difficult situation because you do have native born you have natural born American Chinese American citizens now who have certain rights of citizenship. I mean, not great, but it is significant. For those, just kind of draw a scenario. If you're a father living here and you're, you got a family, your father dies in China, you decide to go back, take care of family business, and now you're being excluded. You can't. They won't let you in, right? The way to get in to the West Coast is through via Angel Island, and famously, you have a bunch of poems that were left on the wall in one of these, maybe like internment cells almost, as people were waiting to be processed or forced expelled. But believe it or not, many Chinese migrants would go through the southern border of California. This is actually some of the first what you would like call crossings that happen because of citizenship status. Um, and so there's a the thing was, Chinese migration in the United States was the first Asian migration. And this is where it gets tricky because so Chinese migration is halted. It doesn't really, via like concrete law, doesn't really come back into effect until I mean, somewhat in the 40s because of World War II and the anti-Japanese sentiment. But honestly, it's probably more the immigration laws of the late 60s where immigration laws to Asia are picked up. And some of that has to do more with the Cold War dynamics. Um, but what's fascinating about this is just that. So Chinese migration was the first. The migration that it just kind of really grows after this point is both Japanese and Korean migration. And as we'll see later, that'll be halted around the 1920s. And the only migration from Asia that really continues is from the Philippines. And we'll talk about why that's important next time we meet.